And welcome, everyone. This is the Mind Sculptors podcast. I am your host, Callahan, and we do have a great show lined up for you today. It is our Innistrad Midnight Hunt set review. Before we get into it today, I do just want to take a moment and thank all of you for joining us this week. If you like this episode or any of our other episodes, please make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below. If you want access to our Discord server, head on over to patreon.com/mindsculptors, where you can help support us there. Also, if you are interested in any of the cards that we are talking about today, head on over to our TCG Player affiliate link, which will also be in the description as well. Joining me today, back on the channel, it's been a few weeks, is my fellow Ohioan, Mr. Cobblepott. Cobble, how you doing today?
Doing well. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to have you back. Glad to be back in the saddle, as it were.
Indeed.
And also joining us is, I'm going to keep calling you this until the day I die, the Frenchman himself, Pongo. Pongo, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. One of these days we'll have a French podcast, no doubt.
So it's interesting because the other day you were talking to Sage, and they are learning French, and you were talking about doing something with them in French, I think it was, in the Discord.
Yeah, just like a little voice chat date. Playing some Magic, just speaking French, basically. Gotcha.
Well, you can see that stuff, by the way, if you are a patron of ours. So head on over to patreon.com/themindsculptors. But anyway, we're here to review some Innistrad Midnight Hunt cards. And by the way, I just have to mention this, is the set, what's it called? The identifier, the letters for this is MID, not IMD, which feels really strange to me. So it's Midnight Innistrad D. It's very strange. I guess it's standing for midnight. But taking a look at our first card, we're starting off with the white cards here, is Vanquish the Horde. It is an 8-mana sorcery that costs 6 colorless and 2 white. And it says destroy all creatures, and this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield. So Cobble, there's some pretty obvious comparisons we could make to some other cards that exist. And, what are your thoughts on this?
So this is a white blasphemous act, basically. And generally, I think you can probably expect this is going to be a 2-mana wrath in many cases. Is that good enough for this to see play? I'm not sure. On the one hand, this is 8 mana as far as the mana value. So if you're running an ad nauseam strategy, this is a big hit if you pull that off the top. It also is destroying all creatures rather than putting -X/-X the way that Toxic Deluge does. So in the situations where something has indestructible or whatever, this is not going to get it done. I think the thing that really puts me off most about it is that this is, so it's going to universally destroy everything, whereas Toxic Deluge, you can kind of be more surgical about it to remove certain things and leave other things on the table, where this is just kind of clearing everything. If you're in white, generally, white's contribution is hate bears or, stacks pieces, things that are proactive permanents that you want to keep on the board. And clearing everything off of the board is really not going to advance your game plan. It's going to be kind of in conflict with what you're trying to do in the white color identity. And for me, that's the biggest thing that puts me off.
Pongo, this is interesting. Do the mono white decks that are really seeing play right now really play wrath effects?
Not a whole lot. And because, like Cobble was saying, there's a serious tension there. If you're playing to the board quite a bit, you generally don't want to wipe the board. Right. Usually you want to just keep adding to it, in fact. So it's interesting because this is kind of, and I've chatted about this with Charles before. This is kind of like one of those weird, I would say, kind of contradictions in the mono white like color pie and sort of in card design for mono white, which is that, you know, obviously it's a very creature oriented color, and plays like lots of small creatures, but then, you know, there's like kind of this other side to the color, which is like wiping the board very frequently. You know, I think that Wizards has taken some serious heroic steps to kind of address that gap between the two sort of class of cards, which is to really lean in on like white's recursion as a source of card advantage, such that like it can kind of make sense to be playing all these weenies and then wipe the board. And then, you know, you've set everybody back, but, you know, you're going to try to accrue value essentially by recurring the things that you put into the graveyard at that point.
Right.
I don't know that we're quite at the point where those cards are numerous, nor are they like powerful enough or playable enough in cEDH such that like, you know, your average mono white deck is going to want to pursue that type of strategy. So this really feels like it's going to be more of like a high color type card, you know, where you would conceivably play it in like a 4-color deck or, you know, like a 3-color deck. And like, I would say that the logical places for that, for it would be in like blue, black, white, or like blue, black, red, white, because obviously, you know, you don't have the additional tension of like wanting to play mana dorks and stuff like that. The issue here though, is that I don't think that this card compares particularly well to a card we just got, which is Damn.
Yeah.
And I think that's like kind of, to me, the obvious comparison where like you have like the modal ability to remove one thing if you're ahead on board. And then for just a tiny bit more mana than this, you can use it as a board wipe if you need that utility. And in addition, it only hits you for 2 off of Adnaz if that's what you're doing. But I think more importantly, like you're not necessarily locked into that potential anti-synergy. So yeah, I just think while Damn exists, like you're probably very unlikely to see this played.
One of all the negatives about this card, one thing that I think we cannot say is a negative is the artwork on this card is gorgeous. On it, like if we were reviewing the art from this set, this would be like one of my favorite arts from the entire set, honestly. Not to take us off the topic of cEDH, but like it looks like an old, like gorgeous painting. And I love this art. So perhaps for that reason only.
I agree. And it's, you know, it's kind of strange for those words to come out of my mouth.
Up next on our list is another white card, is Cathar Commando. It is a 2-mana creature, human soldier, costs 1 colorless and a white. It's a 3/1 with flash. And it has an activated ability that costs 1 colorless. You sacrifice it and destroy target artifact or enchantment. So Pongo, there's some similarities to some other cards. I believe Caustic Caterpillar is one that comes to mind. How much does flash add to that ability?
I love this card. I'm about to gush about this card and about the design of this card. I think flash adds so much to this card, actually. And I think like everyone I've spoken to who is like deeply invested in playing white, and playing white as like a very central part of the strategy that they're pursuing is like super excited about this card. You know, this checks so many boxes for like what white card design needs to be. And it feels like this card was designed with a lot of intention behind it as a result, which like, you know, it just pleases me greatly. So obviously this is a white weenie and that's cool. You know, the fact that it's a 3/1, not irrelevant because that's an aggressive body, but importantly also tutorable with Recruiter of the Guard, which is like super cool. 2-drop recruitable by like a lot of what white is doing, but also, you know, efficient enough that this is playable. This is like an efficient enough rate for cEDH. It has flash, which is super relevant in white, because what does white like to do a lot? It likes to play Rule of Law effects.
Rule of Law.
Exactly, Cobble. So this lets you break parity on your Rule of Law effects by essentially getting an extra spell that you can play. And not only that, you can play this proactively, which is another thing white really likes to do. You can also use it reactively by playing it and then paying one and having that kind of like instant speed interaction effect. I love that it's not white in the casting cost.
Yeah.
It's 1 white, and then the activation cost is also colorless. There's just so many great things about this card, and like I was saying before, it just fits so well into what I want to see out of white cards, and where I want to see white design pushing toward, which is to say more flash, more cards with 1 toughness that are tutorable, or 2 toughness, whatever. Aggressive bodies, because, this is also a card that needs to see play in other formats, and just useful utility.
Mm-hmm. Cobble, in the notes we were talking here, and it looks, you had made a comparison to Lier and Relic Order.
That was actually
excuse
Phoenix.
me, that was Phoenix. Sorry, Jeremy. But when you look at this card, Cobble, in that comparison, how do you feel that comparison holds up, and where does it fit outside of just those mono white strategies?
It's to me the comparison to Caustic Caterpillar is the one that is much more on point to me. I really echo all of the points that Pongo made, particularly the flash part. It's also a human, which is becoming more and more relevant with some of the recent printings. And the thing that is strong about this type of design is that for situations where an opponent is trying to win with a critical enchantment or artifact like, Food Chain or Underworld Breach, a lot of times they're going to prepare for their winning turn with counter magic to be able to disrupt whatever it is that somebody's going to do to remove their critical piece. And having one of these as a rattlesnake that represents a way to remove it without actually casting any spells adds an extra layer of efficacy to your ability to keep people off of the wins that they would otherwise present. So this, rather than Lier and Relic Order, what's the green white
Solly Pride Mage
cat?
Okay.
Yeah, Kasali Pride Mage. That's the one that I think he might have had in mind. I don't want to speak for Jeremy, but I think that this fits in a great number of decks, but it shines the most in decks that are heavily invested in white, just because it plays to the strengths of the game plan that white typically is wanting to do.
I think Commando just ends like Kasali's whole career. Like, honestly, it's just done. I think the comparison to Lier and Relic Order is probably worth mentioning, at least like giving some like surface discussion to, this doesn't really compare to Lier and Relic Order. And the reason why is that Lier and Relic Order is a combo piece. It's a combo card.
Right.
It's not just a removal piece. And this is just a removal piece at the end of the day. I think that there's a lot of decks that would have played Lier and Relic Order fairly, especially like in mono white and low color decks. But then, once you start adding black and red, you're no longer using that card really just
Who needs
as a
to do it
removal piece.
fairly when you can win with it?
Yeah, you're kind of just looking to loop that card. So like, it's nice that it is removal, but that's not really why you're playing it in those decks.
Heading over into the blue side of the spectrum, we've got a card called Fading Hope. It costs 1 blue. It's an instant. And it says return target creature to its owner's hand if its mana value is 3 or less, scry 1. So, Cobblepott. There's people have been starting to play these little bounce spells like this, specifically around things like Dockside. Is this something you see as being really good for that will get more play? What are you thinking?
I think that in general, the metagame could use more creature-oriented removal. A lot of the interaction that a lot of people pack is stack-based interaction for opposing spells, and a lot of times people find themselves in bad situations when somebody drops an opposition agent or, another problematic permanent that is, either gonna, like a hate bear that will disrupt their game plan, or just something that, like having Timna on the board or something like that is an engine for the core of what they're trying to do. This has a lot of flexibility because we're seeing kind of more and more creatures that, particularly that are under the threshold of 3 CMC that are, becoming more and more prevalent. And, particularly things like opposition agent, Esper Sentinel, and the like. And being able to cheaply at 1 mana remove those things and get a scry out of it, along with having the benefit of being able to use it yourself to bounce Dockside profitably and, still get the scry and so on. That's a lot of flexibility, and I think that it fits well into where the metagame should be going, just because I think that there is currently a deficit as far as creature removal is concerned. Yeah.
We were definitely, I believe we were kind of talking about that a little bit on Twitter earlier today. Is those sorts of tempo sort of needs in the meta right now. Pongo, when you look at this card, people, there's certainly the removal side of this. Are there going to be the Nas players who look at this and say, hey, this is a 1 mana card that returns it to my hand, returns Dockside to my hand and lets me scry?
Yeah, so I don't think that this provides enough upside over Unsummon, such that I would be like excited to jam this specifically as like a Dockside doubler. So, to Cobble's point, it is true that probably, and it's kind of become a meme at this point where like we always say play more removal and everyone says play more removal and then no one ever does. And so we just keep saying it. But like a big part of that equation is not just playing more removal, and like a lot of the discourse is not just about around playing more removal, but it's also around playing more hard removal. Because like Cobble mentioned, like opposition agent, for example, it's often not a great target to bounce just because of the flash. The fact that like, if you need to get rid of it, there's a lot of situations where it's quite awkward if your only removal is a bounce spell, because it can come right back down to ruin your day right away. I don't know that we're necessarily in the market for more narrow removal that is bounce removal. Again, Unsummon has kind of always existed, and it's never really been good enough to see widespread play. You've occasionally seen it here and there, generally alongside Dockside, and obviously you're going to play this over that. But I just think that the needs of, in particular, like the Dockside oriented decks are for more flexible removal if they're going to be playing bounce removal. And so they would probably more often than not prefer to play 2 mana bounce spells that can hit anything. If they are choosing to play, removal that also doubles as a Dockside doubler, which is, it's kind of increasingly something that people are moving away from. I have found. So, one place I could conceivably see this would be in like Cody, for example, because it's a 1-drop that gets rid of your Cody, where the Scry is like not all that necessary anyway. But if that deck wasn't playing Unsummoned before, it's not going to play this. I don't think. The Scry one is not relevant enough as an upside.
So let me ask you this, because especially along the lines of removal, where so people aren't playing enough removal, like if we're making the decision on where a lot of cuts end up being really tight, right? Like in a lot of lists, and you're coming down to your last couple of them, and you've got Fading Hope, and you have Suspend left in your deck, and you have to cut like one card. Like realistically, Suspend should probably be the card that you're on over this if you're needing to play more removal. Is that like unfair to say, Cobble?
No, I agree with that. Just because, so if you're playing it as removal, then, everything that Pongo said holds, as in, if it's an someone's got an op agent, you bounce it, they can just play it right away. Whereas the Suspend is going to keep it off of the table for 2 turns. If you want to be using it as a dockside doubler or something similar, then the Fading Hope is going to be the one that's going to be more useful in that capacity. So there is a trade-off, and I would echo that going to the 2 mana range to have more universal targets is probably better in general, just because you want your removal suite to be able to deal with whatever circumstances you're looking at. So,
well, that transitions nicely for us into our next card, which is Geistwave. It is a colorless and a blue instant that says return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. If you controlled that permanent, draw a card. So, Pongo, this feels sort of like Into the Royal. What are we thinking about this card?
Yeah, this is like the Into the Royal variant that like might finally have a high enough
that isn't exactly just Into the Royal renamed.
Yeah, exactly. where like maybe we play it. Yeah, this is a card I'm fairly interested in. Again, it still has a lot of the same issues that we talked about, where like bounce removal is a little less good these days, and meta dependent, a little less good these days. Like a lot of people are kind of moving away from them, just because like sometimes you find yourself in the position where you need to answer multiple stacks pieces, and like bouncing one only to have like another one kind of there, and then you don't have enough time to answer the other one before the first one comes back down really sucks. So that is kind of a strike against, bounce removal in the current metagame. That being said, if we're talking about like Kinnan, for example, blue-green, just blue-green in general, I suppose you could say low color blue decks don't always have a ton of access to really clean permanent answers to like just about anything. You don't get your Abrupt Decays, you don't get your Assassin's Trophy type cards. And in those contexts, I think like the 2 mana bounces are pretty reasonable. I'm pretty high on Resculpt these days, however, because it's kind of like harder removal. But I am interested in playing Geistwave, for instance, in Kinnan. I do think that the upside of being able to draw a card when you bounce one of your own permanents can be relevant relatively often. Especially in that deck. I think that's the type of deck where I'm inclined, for example, if somebody tries to like Gilded Drake my Kinnan, to bounce my own Kinnan as protection. If I look at Najeela as a different example, that's like a situation I think where I'm probably more inclined to keep the Drake and bounce my Najeela and not draw a card, just because of how valuable like that 3/3 flyer can be for a lot of Najeela lines. But like that's very deck dependent in terms of play pattern. This card in decks that have like Dockside are often going to point it at their own card. Kinnan, I think obviously there's that play that I talked about, but one thing that you end up doing a lot in that deck is like post Basalt Monolith. So once you have infinite colorless mana, if you only have access to like one blue mana, a lot of the time you'll use a bounce spell on your own rock so that you can replay it and net 2 colored mana, which can let you play like a transmute artifact or something like that. So like the self bounce spells end up having a lot of flexibility and utility. And this one kind of just has like a really nice edge case where I could conceivably, I can imagine myself using it on my own cards like reasonably often and getting a tiny little bit of value out of it. And I think that, in my experience, I haven't really used the kicker on like the Into the Royal variants quite enough where, I think that they're kind of more consistently value than this, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Cobble, in Storm decks, like say something like Mizzix or another card we're going to be talking about today that we'll talk about when we get there. Would you say this is probably a worthwhile card as something that, is going to draw you a card? It's sort of a cantrip that lets you replay, a dockside in some instances or defend some things. What are your thoughts on Geistwave?
I mean, I think it's very similar to a string of variants that we've had in the 2 mana blue instant bounce a non-land permanent. There's a whole bunch of options, and a number of them see play. And this is, I think, probably on the same level as most of them, as far as, efficacy. And I don't know if there's anything about this that really makes it critical that it's, this is definitely better than Into the Royal, or this is definitely better than any of the other options for the same effect at the same cost.
You know what I want? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Cobble.
The only other thing I was going to say is the thing that bounce does have to lend permanence is that because you're in blue, you're going to have access to Time Twister and Wheel of Fortune or Windfall and stuff like that. So there are circumstances in which you can, imbue some permanence into the removal there, but that is kind of edge case because that's not going to happen very often.
Right. Yeah. What I was going to say is, and it's a little off topic, but what I really, really want is give me 1 blue, an instant that's return target non-land permanent with CMC 3 or less to its owner's hand. Like just like the 1 mana mono blue abrupt decay. Like that would be cool. I'd be in for that.
Or just a Chain of Vapor without a drawback.
Yeah, but that might be a little too good. Like we have that card and it has to be a sorcery.
Yeah.
Well, looking at the next card on our list, is a card that I've seen a lot of people talking about, are pretty excited about, is, I think I say, a Lier, Disciple of the Drowned, which is a legendary human wizard that costs 3 colorless and 2 blue. And the ability on it says spells can't be countered, and each instant sorcery card in your graveyard has flashback. And the flashback cost is equal to that card's mana cost. So, Cobble, when we're looking at this, immediately we're going to be talking about High Tide Shells, right? Like that's what we're immediately thinking of.
For cases where you're using this card as the commander, then yes, that's what most people have been talking about. And in that capacity, I think that it has potential. JVP has had success in that realm as well, but this doesn't have any innate way to mill things into the graveyard. But it has this really interesting tension, because I think a lot of people the first thing that they see about this card is that spells can't be countered, and that's kind of where their focus is. And I think that the Yogwill effect that it has is, I think, the dominant, more important component, just because it's it's the aspect that will allow you to really exploit situations where you've got a well-stocked yard. This has trade-offs, and there's risk that's involved in playing this, because spells can't be countered. That means all spells can't be countered. So if someone tries to cast removal, you won't be able to interact with that unless you're running misdirection effects or unsub effects and that kind of thing, which obviously you're going to do, but it's going to be difficult to protect this guy, just because if people do have removal, he himself is going to make it very difficult to prevent himself from getting removed. I actually am interested in trying this out in the 99 as opposed to being a commander in some sort of maybe a reanimator shell, where we have some way of milling out the whole yard and getting him into play and then storming off with impunity. Haven't drawn up a list on that, but I think it's worthy of exploration.
Pongo, when we're talking about this in the 99 and kind of using this as sort of a Yogwill, do we think this might be a relevant addition to something like JVP High Tide?
Like played in the 99 of other mono blue decks?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting question. I think, that's not absurd, actually, as a proposal. JVP, oftentimes when you're going off with JVP, the issue is not mana, because you are kind of setting up to do the High Tide thing, and then you flash back High Tide, and then you're playing like a bunch of untappers. So like where you occasionally run into trouble with that deck is you kind of just like draw into duds, and you kind of just like you just whiff on like spinning your wheels. And what Lier does, or Lier, I don't know how to pronounce it necessarily, but why people are kind of excited about this card as the helm of that type of deck is that it provides a lot of gas. Like you play a card, you get to replay that card. It's really hard to whiff with this card compared to JVP. That being said, it's also a 5-drop that you can't really play in advance. So you're kind of forced into this position where you have to play it out. And I think in most instances you need to win on the same turn, just because it is a symmetrical effect. Spells can't be countered is crazy text.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, if somebody else tries to Oracle Consult, the's nothing anyone's going to do about it.
Sit there and go, well, okay.
Yeah. Like, I guess we just lose. So, I think that there is a pretty compelling case to be made that this would be stronger in the 99 of a commander who is sort of contributing more early on to that game plan and then can take advantage of both of these abilities when the time comes. Another issue with this card that I have is that, and this is kind of more of a pet peeve, I suppose, than anything, is, a lot of people I have seen discussing brewing this card say like, oh, you don't have to run any counter magic in this deck because spells can't be countered. So like, who cares? Like, I'm just going to be playing unsubstantiate type counter magic or whatever. But like, there's not enough of those. And how are you getting to the point where you're casting your 5-drop commander without losing the game in mono blue, in a shell that does not want to play any stacks probably like whatsoever?
Right.
You need to be playing that whole package of counter magic still, I think. That's just a pet peeve of mine, for, like some of the discussion that I've seen around this deck. I think that people who try to build this deck omitting counter magic, thinking that like, oh, I don't need it, are going to be in for an awakening.
In for a treat.
Yeah, in for a treat when they bring this to a table and find themselves, short on answers for things.
Lier himself is susceptible to counter magic. So if
right.
you want to resolve your commander, you're going to need to be able to protect it.
Yeah. I mean, it is a creature, which helps, but, having him Force of Will kind of sucks, especially if the intention was like, oh, I'm going to High Tide, play him, and then High Tide again and like go off somehow. If he gets countered in all that, you're feeling pretty bad because now you have to get to 7 mana.
And your High Tide's in the yard.
Well, that's not the end of the world. Yeah. He does give things flashback.
Yeah. Next card on a list is a card that I'm pretty flippin' excited for, gotta say.
Best card in the set.
It is Malevolent Hermit. It is a two-faced commander, so it's one of the two-faced card. It costs 1 and a blue. It's a human wizard. And it has the ability of, it costs a blue, sacrifice it to counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 3. I did a horrible job wording through that. And it also has an ability called Disturb, which costs 2 colorless and a blue. That says, well, you may cast this card from your graveyard transformed for its Disturb cost. And its transformed side is called Benevolent Geist. And it's a 2/2 with flying. And it says on it, non-creature spells you control can't be countered. If Benevolent Geist would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So this is a really good card for a variety of axes. Pongo, when we look at this card and there's a lot of different things that this can fit into, what is your immediate thoughts of this card?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. This is a really interesting card. But what immediately comes to mind is obviously, I think, Hermit Druid, and I think that is probably true for a lot of us looking at this card. The idea being that now we can play kind of like a slower, safer Druid style game plan, where
you don't have to yeet yourself into the sun to try and win.
Yeet yourself into the sun, exactly. You can wait until you have a little bit more mana, at which point you get to cast this from your graveyard after you mill your library with Hermit Druid. Or, if you reanimate Hermit Druid after it gets removed the first time around or something like that. And then you get protection kind of for free, and not for free, for 3 mana in your graveyard. But again, we're talking about a sort of more mid-rangey plan. And that's very reasonable considering that Hermit Druid only costs 1 to activate. So, if we're already there, what's 3 more mana? The other thing too is those are decks that in many cases, particularly if we're looking at the Kenrith Hermit Druid decks, are layering Underworld Breach.
Yep.
And so in that package, you're getting Lion's Eye Diamond. And this is really just quite nice to have alongside Lion's Eye Diamond because it makes that card a lot less dead in the sense that you can mill your library. If you happen to just have the Lion's Eye Diamond around, that's your 3 mana to, quote unquote, sort of flash this back, to pay its Disturb cost. And then you get to Dread Return, and your Dread Return is not counterable, which is quite sweet.
There's also the added part, though, of that if you have cards in hand, let's say you have LED, this, and maybe a land in your hand. You've already hit your land drop. I mean, I feel pretty okay of playing my LED, cracking it, and then disturbing this, right?
And just having this. Yeah. 100%. That is probably more likely to happen in Kenrith than it would in a Thrasios Tymna build of that deck, right? Where you kind of are more likely to gas out, I guess. So I do think that this card is quite cool along that axis. I also think it's not unreasonable just played for 2 mana, and then you kind of get that rattlesnake effect where it is a better miscast where, it's a counter non-creature spell as opposed to just instant and sorcery for 3 mana. Kind of just being there and being harder to interact with than in many cases than a Spell Pierce would, or just a miscast would. is pretty relevant. My only concern for that is that because it's on the board, it kind of has like that same effect that, like, like they tutored for Force of Will has, like where your like savvy opponents know to just kind of pass the buck of interaction to you on this for this card if you have it out. But like this is much better than like every variant of that type of card we've ever had. If we're comparing it to like Spiketail Hatchling and like that class of cards, the Curse Catcher type cards, exactly. Because like it's value once you've done that because you get to disturb it later. So like you don't even necessarily feel terrible if that happens.
All right, hold on. I have to get this out of my system. Oh, all right, I feel better. As soon as I saw that ability, that was the first thing that came to mind.
Do you want to say something about Lavinia while you're at it?
Yeah, we're going to play it in Lavinia. All right. I did the brand thing. I did the thing, guys.
There you go.
Dance monkey dance, right?
Yeah. My, I guess like final question about this card is like, if we're not just like underestimating potentially how good it is.
Where is it not good is my question.
Well, I mean, like, it doesn't compare incredibly well to, I think, like Ranger Captain of Eos, for example, or like Grand Abolisher, if you're looking for that type of effect, where it's like considerably more mana intensive to get that like whole plan going. That being said, having like a kind of not easily countered counter spell for 3 mana or, 2 mana and then 1 mana, if you can manage to do it later, can replicate that functionality to some extent. Which is why I'm like asking the question of like, is it possible that we're underestimating how good this card is? And like, we should be considering it in more places. Mm-hmm. It's not irrelevant too, that like when you pay the disturb cost, like you get a flyer, like, so for like the fairer, like Thrasios Tymna decks or like Tymna Crom decks, like you can accrue value just with the Geist. And then like, you have like a personal defense grid, which is pretty hot.
Is so good.
Yeah. So I don't have the answer to that question yet. It feels like a card that kind of needs to be put through its paces to like get a feel for how powerful it might be, like what the ceiling on this card is. And, if whether or not, certain aspects of the card are too easily exploited, and if like the rate on other aspects of the card perhaps is not competitive enough.
Cobble, you like the card Dovescape, and I think this pairs very well with Dovescape, does it not?
It really does. The thing that I think people need to be careful of with this card is that unlike Grand Abolisher or Ranger Captain, this is still interactable.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So when in the Hermit Druid case, if they have universal counter magic, like Force of Will, the disturb ability is not unearth, so it's a cast. So the disturb can be countered. So that's one piece.
Which is good design on Wizards' parts.
Yeah,
too.
But that does apply to Grand Abolisher and Ranger Captain. I
mean, it can. It depends on how you get them into play. If you get them into play off of an activated ability from
sure
Fiend. So that's just one of those things that people need to take into account, because savvy opponents will counter the disturb. Also, there is nothing that stops people from removing Benevolent Geist and then countering the Dread Return. So it's really good. It's great protection, but it isn't flawless protection. So you still need to be prepared to protect it on top of, it isn't a perfect fail-safe, in and of itself. Now, when you combine it with Dovescape, then both of those problems go away, because no one can counter the disturb.
Yeah.
You guys can't see the smile on Cobble's face right now, but it's just like grin, like chin to chin, or
shit-eating grin.
Yeah.
Yes. So no one can counter the disturb, and no one can cast removal for the Geist. So in the case of Dubscape, it is actually a solid seal. That, once you get Elish Norn or something like that, and then
it's a pretty good lock.
No one's going to do anything. But I have no illusions about the efficacy of Dubscape in the metagame. So it's a dream, but
it sounds like a pretty good dream, though.
If you get all that stuff,
sure,
all on the board at the same time, you deserve to win. Like, frankly, you got the Exodia, right. So like GG's, right?
Yep.
So,
but just to reiterate, this is a phenomenal card that's really flexible. I mean, yes, it's good in the contexts that we talked about, but it's going to be good in other contexts as well. I think it's a great mid-range card, just because early game, it's got the rattlesnake counterspell aspect to it, and then at any other point it can just transition into I win all the counterspell wars kind of situation, or I can't be interacted with for my combo. It just has a lot going for it, and I think that they showed. I'm glad that design showed restraint in making adding some points of vulnerability. Making the Disturb a cast instead of, an activated ability, making the creature removable,
like in
those things
in Modern, for instance, like you can bolt this in Standard and Historic, you can shock this, like it's very interactable.
Right. Whereas, you think of Thassa's Oracle, where there was very little restraint in the design there. And this looks much more measured. Yeah. And it's still a great card, but it's, I think, a better
card. It's just so well designed.
As far as health-wise is concerned, yes.
Yeah, I think I agree. My only caveat is that, like, I'm not 100% sure it's going to be like the slam dunk card of the set, or like it's going to be a slam dunk type of card in like every context, but like there's decks that are really happy to get this card.
Windmill slamming this card.
100%.
Yeah.
And like, obviously I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention Cole, Thunderfarts and Azami, playing, holding on for the mono blue dream.
Freaking broke the curse. We've worked so hard to not mention that deck here, and you've ruined it. What have you done, Pongo?
Shout out to Cole.
We love you, Cole. Next card on our list is what I think should be the new name for the Lab Maniacs, is a Triskaidekaphile. Did I say that right, Cobble?
Yep.
Okay. So this is a new human wizard that's a 1/3. It costs a colorless and a blue. And it says you have no maximum hand size. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you have exactly 13 cards in your hand, you win the game. And it has an activated ability that costs 3 colorless and a blue. It says draw a card. So do you think, Cobble, that Cameron is going to be changing the name of the group anytime soon? Or is this card not quite good enough?
I wouldn't bet on it. So,
well,
I mean, I'm not high on this card, but it does have the text "win the game," so there's stuff to look at and talk about. So, the no maximum hand size it's meh, but there are certain situations like with, Ad Nauseam or Necropotence where that actually becomes useful. The having 13 cards in your hand, I mean, you're not gonna, I don't see in a lot of situations where you're just going to accumulate cards kind of blindly, because you're going to be using those cards as play, because you're interacting with other players. So generally, the way that these Thrasios or Kenrith draw abilities work is once you go infinite, then you just draw your deck. So getting to 13, I think most of the times you get to that point, you might as well have just drawn your whole deck. Right. And in that case, you don't need to have an I win the game on the card because you've drawn your deck and you're going to win anyway. So
with a different card that says I win the game.
Sure. But I'm not super excited about this. Yeah. I am, I would love to be proven wrong, but for me, it just doesn't get there.
Pongo, what do you think? Do you think we should petition Cameron to change the name of the Lab Maniacs to the Triskaidekaphiles?
I mean, I've said it before and I'll say it again. If they haven't changed their name to the Oracles, then we're not. What are we doing, right? I don't think we're changing it to Triskaidekaphiles anytime soon. Which is to say, I agree with Cobble that this card kind of makes you jump through too many hoops compared to like Laboratory Maniac or Thassa's Oracle, more notably, to actually take advantage of that you win the game text. That being said, that is very powerful text. And this is, it has a lot of additional text. I think, the spellbook effect.
Like flavor text.
Yeah. The spellbook effect is not irrelevant in some cases. One could imagine playing this in like a blue-black deck and like have necropotent stuff going on and like the no maximum hand size can be relevant. The only issue is that Thassa's Oracle exists and there's like so much pressure to play that card if you're in that color combination. And like this is not doing quite enough, I think, to like alleviate that pressure.
So let me posit then a hypothetical. I get my wish, Thassa's Oracle gets banned tomorrow. All right. Is this now better, or do we still just sit on Lab Maniac?
We're still just playing Laboratory Maniac. I think in the vast majority of those shells, especially like the ones that have Tymna, and like you kind of have access to draw effects very easily as a result.
Does this get better? Like, is this more viable if your options are, do I want to go this route or this route, or is it still just unplayable?
Yeah, I mean, so when you're talking about like Thassa's Oracle potentially getting banned, realistically, I think like just about everything gets more viable if that card gets banned, if even just marginally. And I think that's where I'm at with Triskaidekaphile, where it gets like marginally more viable if that card gets banned, just because like
it go from like a 1 to a 2.
It goes from like a 0.1 to a 0.2 perhaps. There are other situations or other places where I could conceivably see this card seeing play. We mentioned a zombie before. I'm sorry to mention her again. I got yelled at for that. And like that's a deck where the fact that this is a wizard is relevant. The fact that it says you win the game is equally pretty relevant, right? Because like it's hard to come by that kind of effect. Still kind of has the issue of probably not being better than just like Paradigm Shift and Thassa's Oracle. And like the 4-mana draw card is super irrelevant in that shell. The other place that I have seen people exploring this, and this is going to be a shout out to Reed, Sick Robot, is I did see that he had brewed a Thrasios Elgeth deck. If I'm remembering the commander properly, the partner, it's the mono blue Sphinx that makes it so that all of your scries turn into draws, which like with Thrasios, pretty freaking hot, I must say. Because you get to scry and then you also get to draw a card. So like you get to draw 2 cards off each activation. And then, you're less incentivized in that shell to play Thassa's Oracle, even though, you could conceivably play like Thought Lash type stuff in that deck too. But like, it's possible that I'm like missing homes for this deck where it would make a lot of sense. But if there is one where it makes sense, it's like possibly in that deck, where like it's clearly a control deck, and it's clearly just like kind of, no offense, sick, but like a somewhat memey fringe kind of like value ball, like blue-green valuable.
You know what?
deck.
No. Reed, don't let him shame you publicly into not playing this card. You play this card to your heart's
There's no
content.
shame. I mean, like, listen, like I will farm wins off of Reed. Like I will never tell anyone not to play anything. I am all for people playing whatever they want, and if they lose as a result, like, so be it.
Oh, man. Next card on our list is a card that might see some fringe play, is a card called Spectral Adversary. It's a spirit that is 2/1 with flash and flying. And the text on it is part of this is his new cycle of these. And this one seemed a little bit more interesting than some of the other ones. This one says when Spectral Adversary enters the battlefield, you may pay a colorless and a blue any number of times. When you pay this cost one or more times, put that many +1/+1 counters on Spectral Adversary, then up to that many other target artifacts, creatures, and or enchantments phase out. So Cobble, where are we seeing this? Like, this is very mana intensive, right? But it has flash. It's a little bit defensive. What are we seeing with this?
I mean, I think that Brago, which I mean doesn't see a whole lot of play, is to me the most likely place, just because this is an enters the battlefield ability and it's not an on-cast ability. Mm-hmm. So being able to, get your blink going, and then as it comes, back into play, and you've brought all of your artifacts back into play untapped, you can just sink everything into removing somebody's board, or interacting with people in a way that is disarming. I'm not a big fan of the just phasing out people's permanents, because phasing out people's permanents on your turn is not going to be great, because once it comes back to their turn, then they're going to phase back in. So that's why this has flash. So even in that context of being able to blink it's okay. You can use it to keep people from interacting with you on your second main if you're going to go for a win or something like that. But I mean, even in the context of Brago, that's not when you win. You win during the combat step. Right. So I'm not super enthused.
Pongo, do you think this is very good, or what are you thinking on it?
Yeah, there was a good amount of hype around this card when it got spoiled. I'm kind of in a similar boat to Cobble, where I'm not necessarily sold on this card. Obviously the interaction with Brago is cute. And if there's any place where I could like maybe see it seeing play, it would be there, just because this is technically removal that you can recur. And you can do fun stuff with it. And if there's like something like a Null Rod or a Collector Roof in play, this kind of cleans it up nicely on your combo turns, while also like being able to be used like in a slightly different way, where you can kind of like end step it, and or even just use it at instant speed to like interact with something in particular. If we're talking about like a Seedborn Muse or something, like the type of thing that you would potentially want to interact with sort of more proactively. That being said, if we're talking about like the other potential home for it, like the sort of like Tymna grindy decks, I get the argument where it's like, okay, I can flash this out on end step and get rid of a hate piece. And then also this is kind of like decent value as just like a Tymna attacker, et cetera, et cetera. But it just kind of feels like very mana intensive to use this as an answer for anything. Like it feels like a lot, like 4 mana to answer something temporarily. It's possible that we should be evaluating this as kind of like a bounce spell that's like hard to counter, more mana intensive, but like can also be just played for 2 mana as like a Tymna attacker, and such like makes sense in like your like Tymna Crom style decks. But I don't know. Like personally, I guess I would have to like see it in action before I could really believe it, just because like I'm a little bit, I don't know that having that modality is necessarily better than just having a more efficient answer for things, right? Like just like a 2 mana answer. You know, in a lot of situations, like the type of thing that you would want to be removing is constraining your mana to some extent. And that just exacerbates like the issue of it costing 4 mana.
So, you know, would you rate this a C then? Since, you know, we just got done doing our tier list.
I'm gonna rate it a wait and see. Because I'm interested to see, you know, people explore the card and see if it's actually all that it's cracked up to be.
Awesome. Well, next card on our list is, as we start to move into the red cards, is Cathartic Pyre. It is an instant that costs 1 colorless and a red, and it's modal. It says choose 1. Cathartic Pyre deals 3 damage to target creature or player. The other option is discard up to 2 cards to draw that many cards. So Pongo, with this card, with Cobble, we're really seeing with this card that there's some comparisons you can make to, hey, look, we have another Abrade variant.
Yeah, and it's not really an Abrade, but it's a modal 2 mana red instant that lets you remove a card or remove a creature and have the option to do a different thing. So in most circumstances, the option to remove an artifact, I think, is going to be more impactful than doing a careful study. But I mean, there's going to be circumstances where you've got Underworld Breach in play, and, you know, being able to cast this to, you know, just basically draw 4 cards is, you know, that's reasonable.
Right.
It's an interesting design area just because it can enable, you know, certain circumstances of, you know, reanimation if people are doing Sire of Insanity kind of shells. It's interesting. I don't think that it bumps Abrade out of most lists.
Pongo, your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with Cobblepott, where it's like, you have to be playing a very, very specific deck, I think, where like you are excited to have the Faithless Looting effect. Not that Faithless Looting isn't a good card. It's obviously kind of a stupid card if other formats ban lists are anything to go by. But like, it's not an effect that you necessarily want in many, many decks in this format. You know, even Reanimator decks like are not really playing all that many like just one-shot discard outlets anymore. Like if you look at like Razakats, which like, and the Thrasios Tymna version obviously can't play this card, but like historically played like one-off, like draw 2, discard 2, like kind of like the careful study type cards,
Frantic Search.
I don't even know that they're playing like Mausoleum Wanderer or not Mausoleum Wanderer, the 2 mana creature discard outlet where that draws a card whenever an opponent casts a card from not in their hand.
Oh, the Phantasm.
Yeah, exactly. The Spirit.
Ghostly something.
There you go. Ghostly Pilfer. Exactly. Yeah, I don't know that card makes the cut in all of those decks anymore. And that kind of just like is just kind of going to show that like the one-time draw discard kind of utility is not necessarily super valued anymore. I know that, for example, Krark Sagashima is playing Faithless Looting. This is maybe a card that they would be interested in as potentially an upgrade, just because it's also an instant, which like kind of helps make up for the fact that it costs 1 additional mana. You can't flash it back, which kind of sucks because that's actually a pretty relevant part of Faithless Looting if you've ever played much of that card. But the fact that this is creature removal is actually quite good. Like we were talking about before, you know, we certainly should be playing more of that. I think people shouldn't be playing more of that, but that's obviously for selfish reasons. But like, yeah, I would tend to agree with Cobble. This isn't necessarily taking the place of a Braid for the decks that want more flexible removal. It's interesting to see, like, I don't know what number version of this card this is, right? Because we got, like, you find some prisoners last set as well.
Right.
So I don't know if this is 3 or 4, but this is like kind of quickly becoming like the Into the Royal design space for red, which is pretty funny. Like the 2 mana red instant that like either deals 3 damage to a creature or removes an artifact and then does like some other thing. But these ones are like, you know, no shade to like Into the Royal. These are like way cooler. Like most of them are way cooler.
On to our next card on the list is a card that we have on here specifically for our friend Ken.
Speaking of
Kirk, is Curse of Shaken Faith. It is an enchantment or a curse that costs 1 colorless and a red, and you enchant player. When enchanted player casts a spell other than the first spell they cast each turn or copies a spell, Curse of Shaken Faith deals 2 damage to them. So Pongo, we have here in big bold letters in our notes to do what with this card?
Cast this on the Krark player, obviously. Pretty relevant that it says whenever they copy a spell, coincidentally. Yeah, this is going to ruin their day. It's really quite difficult for them to interact with this short of their blue bounce spells. And obviously, they're kind of halted from progressing as long as this is on them. Or you know, they can try, but like this is going to kill them pretty quickly. This is not a playable card, to be absolutely clear. I think that if you were interested in this effect, like in earnest and not just like to grief the resident Krark player, you would probably play Eidolon of the Great Revel rather than this. And I think, you know, just tax like every spell that people are playing, even if it's just like the first one each turn.
Which, for what it's worth, I do think is a worthwhile card. In some, I think there is a burn shell out there that we just haven't explored that is worth talking about. Anyway, back to what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, it is relevant that that this counts every spell as opposed to just like spells that cost like a certain CMC or less.
And copies.
And copies, yeah, not irrelevant, but it's so narrow that it only affects one player, right?
Right.
Like you certainly want this effect, I think, to affect everyone and to be more of like a hate piece as opposed to like kind of like a very specific targeted like irritation. Like
right.
So yeah, I don't actually think that this is necessarily a playable card in cEDH just because there's other options that do the same thing better.
Yeah, that's fair. On to our next card. This card looks like it might be playable. Is Mooveil Regent. It's part of a new sort of card we've been getting from Wizards here recently. The Regent cycle of cards. It's a dragon that's a 4/4 that costs 3 colorless and a red with flying. And it says whenever you cast a spell, you may discard your hand. If you do, draw a card for each of that card's or of that spell's colors. When Mooveil Regent dies, it deals X damage to any target where X is the number of colors among permanents you control. So, Cobble, when we look at this card, what are we thinking with it? Does it make the cut? Where does it fit? What are your thoughts?
So this can be used in a couple of different ways. I mean, I think the intended design space was for people to, you know, go Wooburg and find a way to make some sort of an engine where they're, you know, drawing 5 cards, casting one of them, dumping your hand, drawing 5 more cards, and, you know, right. Where I think in practice, this is really going to be much more of a mono red card where, you know, you're in that typical situation where you've got nothing in hand and you just need to draw more cards. So and you're basically just pulling things off of your top deck anyway. I don't think that it's tremendous in that way, just because it still doesn't solve the problem of when you hit a land.
Right.
Is, once there's a land on top of your deck, all the cards that are of that vein that let you cast the top card of your deck or whatever, then you don't have a lot to work with. So for that reason, I'm not particularly, interested. There's people talking about using it with Painter's Servant, which I don't know if that makes this worse, because it's going to make your spells monocolor. So I don't know quite how that interaction will work, but I'm not convinced that that's going to be great. Some people talk about Animar, and basically in Animar this would be a 1 mana card that then becomes a storm variant if you've got something that can bounce itself when it comes back. So, presumably the Ancestral Statue, which is the colorless 4 mana bounce a creature when it comes into play, in which case you would draw your deck.
Well, except that this is you draw a card for each of that spell's colors, right?
Yeah, so that wouldn't even work. So yeah. Yeah, I really don't like this card.
Well, I mean, you can do some stuff with like Shrieking Drake in this card, right? Because this is a cast trigger. So you would have the Shrieking Drake on the stack. Then like you discard your hand, draw a card, and then you can like do that repeatedly. It's interesting to think about. I'm not so sure that deck wants that type of like pretty high variance sort of engine. Right. It has like a lot of access to already to like effectively 1 mana cards that generate a lot of value. But it's interesting to think about because, like you mentioned, with Painter Servant, and that's a deck that plays Painter Servant. So like, if there was ever like the conjunction of factors or like the combination of things, or a place where those two things are coming together, it's Animar, right? But ultimately, if I'm evaluating this card, not in the context of Animar, I think that this is a constructed card. I think that this is very much like a pushed mythic meant to be played as the top end in like a red-based aggro deck in standard. And like, if you think about this in the context of aggro, it's actually pretty absurd, right? Because by the time you hit 4 mana, you're probably like emptying out your hand. And then you're kind of cantripping with like all your top decks that are not lands from that point on, which is like pretty hot. And it's also a 4/4. And also like conveniently it like does a little bit of damage when it dies, which is not a relevant text, especially when you're trying to kill them dead quick. So yeah, maybe it doesn't see play in cEDH, but I'm not too concerned about this guy finding a home somewhere.
Yeah. Next card on the list is an artifact that is Moonsilver Key. Very important in the story of this set, evidently. It costs 2 colorless mana, and its activated ability costs 1 colorless mana. You tap it, sacrifice the card, and search your library for an artifact card with a mana ability or a basic land card. Reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. So, Pongo, when we look at this card, it's kind of similar to Expedition Map-ish, but it does have the ability to find like Mox Opal, or not Mox Opal, but all those things. Like, where do we stand on this?
This is a terrible Expedition Map. Like, I don't think that basic land part is relevant for any context other than limited. The limited format where this is going to see play. Like, obviously, why are we playing this card? It's because it tutors an artifact. I'm supremely interested in this card for Kinnan in particular, where it finds Basalt Monolith. That deck just wants more ways to win the game, basically, to like find your Basalt Monolith. And the really cool part about this card is that we just recently got Treasure Vault, which also happens to be an artifact with a mana ability. So this is both a tutor for Basalt Monolith, as well as a purely colorless way post Basalt Monolith to tutor for an outlet for the infinite mana off that combo. So this feels to me like a slam dunk for that deck. And it's like one of those cards like we were talking about before that just to me, if we get more cards like this that really push that Treasure Vault plan in Kinnan, I'm gonna simultaneously be happy and sad. Happy that that deck is getting more powerful because I love that deck, but sad because all that effort that I put in developing the Mirage Mirror lines are going to become that much more redundant and ultimately probably irrelevant.
Is it time to put those lines to bed yet?
No, we're not. I don't think we're quite there yet. And I guess it's worth bringing that up while we're discussing this card. You still probably want to play Treasure Mage just because it lets you convert your creature tutors into Basalt Monolith. And then once you're playing Treasure Mage, you probably just want to be playing a 3-mana outlet that's pure colorless, like an artifact that it can also tutor up, assuming you have another way to get infinite colorless, or rather another way to tutor up Basalt Monolith in your hand. And that kind of implies that you want to keep all those lines with like Phantasmal Image. Not necessarily Phantasmal Image, but obviously you can play that, but rather Phyrexian Metamorph, just so you can have like the purely colorless way to clone your Treasure Mage,
right.
and kind of just go off that way, tutoring both pieces. But no, this is a great card. Really great to have redundancy for artifact tutors. I think that there's other decks that are probably interested in this card as well. But like, yeah,
I think the preferred pattern.
Go ahead.
For turning it into a Basalt Monolith is casting this and then transmute artifact.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, that's for sure. But jokes aside, what's really sick about this card actually is that Kinnan is a deck I think that as much as possible loves to be able to do everything with colorless mana. Because if you think about it, you have like a lot of lines where you accelerate out a bunch of rocks, you get Kinnan. If you have like a Soul Ring or like a Mana Crypt or something like that, there's many situations where that mana, you don't necessarily get to use it because like your hand is pretty color mana intensive. But to be able to go like, Kinnan and then like Soul Ring into this is pretty damn sweet. And this kind of has like the Wishclaw Talisman effect where you can even play it out in advance and then get like a 1-mana tutor for Basalt Monolith on like the turn you're ready to commit to a win. So this is a slam dunk card there at least. And I could see it in other low colored decks that really care about a particular artifact with the mana ability.
Right. Cobble, what are your thoughts?
When I first read it, I got really excited because I thought that it said artifacts with an activated ability. And it was like, oh man, there's all kinds of things that, you can get with this. And then I read it more carefully and then realized, oh, okay. So you either get a Mox or you get Basalt Monolith or Phyrexian Altar or something like that. The mana flow for it is a little bit awkward. We compared it to Expedition Map, which flows nicely because it's a 1-mana artifact then you activate for 2. This is a 2-mana artifact that you activate for 1, so it's a little bit clumsy in that way. But beyond that, I think that basically everything that Pongo said is right on. It's for the decks that want this ability, this is a great tool because it's just going to add more redundancy for them to be able to get those lines put together in a consistent way.
Yeah. Next card on our list, as we start to look into the multicolored cards, is Brutal Cathar. It is a 3-mana, it costs 2 colorless and a white, human soldier werewolf 2/2 that says when this creature enters the battlefield or transforms into Brutal Cathar, exile target creature an opponent controls until this creature leaves the battlefield. And it's a day-bound, night-bound card. So if a player casts no spells during their turn, it becomes night. next turn. And then if you cast a spell and it's night out, it comes in night, right? Is that correct?
If you cast 2 spells while it's night, it becomes day.
Well, my question is if I cast this and it's nighttime in the because it's like an action in the game.
So
so if it's currently night, this is such a weird mechanic. If it's currently night, it comes into play on the flip side,
yes,
right?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Okay. So the flip side is a Nightbound card that says Moonrage. It's Moonrage. Did I say that right? Brute.
Yep.
Which is a 3/3 werewolf with first strike and ward. You have to pay 3 life. The big hook to this cobble is there's a deck that a good friend of ours is a big fan of, who runs that Winota deck. And what are your thoughts on this card in general, but also in the Winota shell?
I think that in the Winota shell, it's absolutely excellent. Just because the front face of this is a human, so it can be found and put onto the battlefield off of the Winota triggers, and then once it flips, then it triggers Winota. So you got excellent synergy there. The ability of the Fiend Hunter kind of ability where it comes into play and exiles a creature. Something to be real clear about is that ability will keep on triggering every time it flips, and the wording of transform does not mean that you exile the card and bring it back into play. You just flip it.
Yep.
So the card never actually leaves play. So instead of just kind of continually exiling the same creature again and again, this accumulates more and more creatures as it flips. So it becomes pretty useful in that regard as far as being a repeatable means of keeping threatening creatures or commanders off of the battlefield. That said, outside of Winota, I mean, things that are going to have red and white, I can think of like Blood Pod. I don't know if this gets there in Blood Pod. I don't know if Blood Pod gets there anymore. But I think that the synergy that it has for Winota is exciting enough to warrant this card getting some play in that context.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting tension that this card has with a lot of the decks that would, I think, conceivably play it. And Winota is probably an exception to that rule that I'll get into. But it turns out that a lot of the decks that would want to be playing this card are also playing Rule of Law effects. And if you're playing Rule of Law effects, it becomes essentially impossible to leave night unless the Rule of Law effect can be removed. So that means that you're probably not getting that much like repeated value out of this card in many circumstances. That being said, not necessarily that big of a deal for Winota, because I think if you're playing Winota, you are already content that this is a hit off of Winota that is just going to answer one creature. And if it does flip into the Moonrage Brute, then it's a Winota trigger, right? It just, even if you can't use it as an engine, you get to use it as an engine. So that's pretty sweet. So I certainly agree with, everything that's been said. And yeah, I think that that's the natural home for it, just because there is that kind of awkward tension for a lot of the other contexts you would want to play it.
Yeah, for sure. Next card on our list is Suspicious Stowaway, which is a human rogue werewolf, another werewolf that costs a colorless and a blue. It's a 1/1, and it says Suspicious Stowaway can't be blocked. Whenever Suspicious Stowaway deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, then discard a card. And it is also a daybound, nightbound card, so that's its daybound face. Its nightbound face is Seafaring Werewolf. That is a 2/1, and it also can't be blocked. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So it's the same card. It just ends up getting 1 extra point of damage in. Pongo, what are your thoughts on
slight
this?
Correction? It's not the same card, actually. It goes from being a looter to being just a straight draw.
Oh, that's correct.
This is, I'm about to geek out again, but like the design for this card is actually freaking funny. Like it's really cute that it goes from being a blue card that is loots when it deals damage, which is, fully a blue card thing, into being a green card, which is ostensibly supposed to be like kind of worse at drawing cards than a blue card, but like actually kind of hard draws a card. The other really funny part about this card is that it is fully just a blue card. Like it does not need to be a green card. So, that aspect of it is kind of cute. The fact that it becomes green when it flips, but ultimately you're always playing it off of blue mana. So it's not really remotely a color pie break.
Right.
Even though it does discard a card, which is like looting is not really a thing that green would do. I think that this is a pretty fun card. It's in that awkward spot of being, like a 2 mana, quote unquote draw engine that doesn't necessarily give you value right away because of summoning sickness. Whereas we have like a lot of alternatives that can give you some value right away. Notably, like we can look at like Mindblade Render in like Najeela decks. Alternatively, now we can also be talking, well, we mentioned it before, but like the Ghostly Pilferer, which can give you some degree of value right away. And if you were considering playing this for like the looting aspect, you would almost certainly play that card before this because it's just a free discard outlet. These are sort of a combination of factors that mean that this card doesn't necessarily have any clear great home, with one exception. That can't be blocked text, and in addition, that rogue text are supremely relevant for one deck, and that's Edric. So, yeah, I think that like Edric is the type of deck that historically has considered playing looter, like Looter El Core, just because like it can't be blocked really, and then just like drawing a card and then like also looting on top of that is kind of like enough value that that deck is happy to play this, or that this is like pretty much just like a straight upgrade from that card. It has the relevant creature typing, and then it can also flip into something that is a little bit more powerful. And it's in the color identity. So, if there was ever going to be a deck to play this card, it would be that.
Yeah. Cobble, any other thoughts on this? Is this maybe something that you could play in TNT?
I mean, it's possible. I mean, anything that is evasive is going to fit well with Tymna. Mm-hmm. So that's conceivable. Is it something that is that upside good enough to warrant its inclusion? I mean, you still see Adversary
rarely,
from time to time.
Yeah.
Rarely.
You don't really see much Bob anymore either.
Right. So it's one of those things where I think it's a slam dunk in Edric, but in other places it's not. I don't know if it's compelling enough. I did want to just push back on Pongo saying that it's not in Green's identity to have creatures that draw cards. And I'm thinking of Adversary, Toski, Bearer of Secrets, Orin Frostfang.
It's not in Green's color identity to have to loot.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can draw, but this is a card that's not fully a green card. It's fully a blue card, which is fine because you pay blue mana to play it.
That makes sense. But yeah, that's all that I had.
Yeah. Next commander on our list is a first commander, or next commander on our list, is Old Stickfingers. It costs X black and a green, and its power and toughness are equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. And what it says is whenever you cast a spell, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal X creature cards. Put all creature cards revealed this way into your graveyard, then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So Cobblepott, there are some builds with this, specifically Reanimator builds, that are wanting to be doing Necrotic Ooze sorts of things, correct?
Yeah. So basically, those decks are making it such that there's only 3 or 4 creatures in the deck besides the commander, so that when you do cast your commander, you know exactly what you're going to be milling into the yard. And basically, you have some sort of reanimation in hand, and you cast your commander and then reanimate the news, and then you go off. So there's a couple different ways people can do it. I mean, you can have Walking Ballista and Phyrexian Devourer plus, Necrotic Ooze and, just shoot everybody in the face. Or you can use Necrotic Ooze with Asmodeus, the new demon from Forgotten Realms, and Scourge Familiar to draw your deck and then do whatever you want. The notable thing there being Asmodeus has the drawback of not being able to draw the cards, but that's on Asmodeus. So if you're activating that ability with Necrotic Ooze, then you don't have that drawback. So you do get to draw the cards. So, and in both cases, some people throw in as a 4th creature Sylvan Safekeeper as a way to protect the combo.
And there's no Hull Breacher to screw up Asmodeus anymore.
That's right. And you can, ostensibly use Survival of the Fittest, but generally that's not a great card in decks that have 4 creatures. Mm-hmm. So the thing about this that is hard is that one of the things that black and green are really good at is, 1, tutoring creatures, and 2, ramp. And most of the ramp in green is going to be dorks, which you're not going to want to run because you're going to only be running the specific creatures that you're looking for as part of your combo. And you're not going to run your tutors that, your Eldritch Evolution kind of cards either, because you want to use your commander to assemble your combo. So it's one of those things where the imposition of only being able to have the 3 or 4 creature cards in the deck really undermines the deck's ability to do what black and green are really good at doing.
Right.
And ostensibly you could, instead of making it a combo deck, you can try to come up with something that is a more typical green-black deck that, just uses the commander for value, but that isn't really something that is going to, I think, be compelling in the cEDH metagame. So it's one of those things where it's a really interesting design space. It's an interesting idea. I just don't think it's going to get there.
Pongo, we were talking about this before we went on air, and you have not been hearing very positive things from the people who have been brewing this, correct?
Yeah. So the only thing that I would kind of add to what Cobble was talking about is actually, I think most of the lines that have been discussed there are not necessarily sort of like the fashionable lines that people are using in their current brews for this deck, even though I think that they're kind of like some of the more obvious like starting places to brew this commander. But I think that Connie from the r/competitive EDH Discord has done a lot of work with this deck. That's concrete on Mox Field. And so she essentially worked out, or I'm not sure if she did, but she writes about some lines in her primer for the deck where you pile with cEDH Undead Viziers. So that's like the mono black cEDH. That's a demonic tutor. Mikaeus the Unhallowed, and a card called Rot Hulk. Rot Hulk being a card that when it enters the battlefield, you return up to X target zombie cards from your graveyard to the battlefield, where X is the number of opponents you have. So typically you're going to have 3 opponents, which means that you get to bring up to 3 zombies back. Mikaeus and cEDH are both zombies, so you clearly bring those back. Then you've got Mikaeus giving non-human creatures Undying. So you get to kind of like double tutor with cEDH. And, you know, the lines are kind of more or less like similar in concept, except that, you know, you don't have to necessarily worry too much about like some of the issues that you can occasionally run into, like with the news piles and being weaker to like, you know, like certain forms of hate. So these seem to be at least the fashionable lines. And you know, you're getting to tutor a bunch of times and like netting mana off of like, you know, like culling ritual or just like culling the weak type cards that you're tutoring for. So, you know, at the end of the day, it's kind of not incredibly relevant how you're winning. And like the pile itself is ultimately constructed in a way that no matter what cards you're using, it should kind of just win on the spot. I think while being as weak to as little hate as possible, and resistant to as much interaction as possible. But like the problem with this commander, from what I gather, is that it ends up still being pretty mana intensive to pull the lines off. You're not necessarily in great colors to extend the game to the point where you have access to all of that mana. And obviously you can play a ton of ritual type effects, but like you're pretty vulnerable on the axis of like your reanimation spell, which is kind of like your 1 card win condition once you've cast and entombed with Stickfingers. So it just, you know, again, from what I gather, from what I hear, it just kind of appears that the piles are not compelling enough. The win condition is not mana efficient enough to really, I guess, consistently hang with some of the more mana efficient or more grindy black-green options or even higher color options in the format.
Well, until like what you were saying, Cobble, I mean, like you don't get to run any of the good creatures effectively in creature tutors in these colors. And that really takes away from why you're wanting to play like green black to begin with, right?
Right. And even some of the things that you have as protection, things that, you know, like Allosaurus Shepherd or Destiny Spinner, you know, the permanent cards that give you some level of protection where you don't have stack interaction. In this shell, the constraints of the deck make it so that you can't run those, and it's kind of just self-defeating. And like I said, it's a cool design and it's thought provoking, but it just isn't going to get there.
Right.
It's interesting that it's the type of card that does conceivably get stronger with new cards being printed. And you know, you could easily envision a world where you know, we get a more compelling compact like 2-card combo. But you know, it seems like most of the combos thus far are mostly 3-card combos that people are trying out, which puts like, you know, X equals 3. So like 5 mana up front plus your reanimation spell makes it a little bit expensive. You know, I again, we're talking about a space where like we're going to get tons of new creatures that do things in the graveyard, or provide, you know, some value when reanimated, or, you know, like do powerful things when reanimated, or, you know, just traditional green black things. I think it's only a matter of time before this deck gets something similar to like when Cody got Profane Tutor that like really pushes it way more into the viability tier. But obviously I think, you know, like not you shouldn't read too much into that comparison. I don't know that this will ever get a card.
Ever see another Cody?
Yeah, I don't know that you'll ever see a card that makes this as good as 5-color ad nauseum. But nonetheless, I could easily see it getting pushed more, closer to other green-black options like Virals, for example.
Yeah. Next card up on our list is a card that I know you are probably a little bit excited about, Pongo, is Rite of Harmony. It's a green and a white instant that says whenever a creature or enchantment enters the battlefield under your control this turn, draw a card, and it has flashback that costs 2 colorless and green and white. So Pongo, this is a Najeela card, isn't it?
Yeah, with the caveat that it still might not be good enough. But because Najeela's the sort of barrier to entry for just like 5-color good stuff is exceptionally high. So naturally this has like incredible synergy with Najeela, right? This kind of works the way we hoped Mystic Reflection would work, but didn't ultimately pan out. I've played around with this card a little bit. I've had in a few games and it's impressed. But it still has kind of some awkwardness. What I really like about it is that it's only 2 mana, which means that, you're getting to play it early. And also you can kind of double spell on the same turn. So it's like perfectly reasonable to play this and still have the ability to hold up interaction. The challenging part about this card is that a pretty typical curve with Najeela is to play Najeela on turn 2. I've been pushing the deck more and more to try to get turn 1 Najeelas, which I think, you can speak from experience, Callahan, happens a lot more these days than it used to. And Rite of Harmony becomes a lot more powerful when you get a turn 1 Najeela. But if you think about like the kind of baseline case of getting Najeela on turn 2, this is turn 3, with Najeela only draw 1 card for 2 mana, which is not spectacular. Obviously, you can also just play like a Mana Dork and draw another card, or you can play like your Carpet of Flowers and this and draw a card, which is absurd. You can also play like Dockside Extortionist and like take extra combat steps and draw additional cards. So, even early on when you don't necessarily have a ton of warriors in play, it can still do some kind of nutty things. But more often than not, if you have the turn 2 Najeela, you're looking to cast this maybe on turn 4. And the awkward part is that turn 4 is kind of like the turn where Najeela is got everything she needs to try to win. So, what's cool about this card is that it's kind of like you can conceive of it as kind of occupying sort of like the Toski slot for certain Najeela builds. Or at least you can compare it to that card, where that's a 4 mana grind engine, which, kind of also most likely comes down on the later turn, turn 3 if you're willing to tap out, or turn 4 if you're, if you want to play it and be able to double spell, hold up interaction. This card is kind of similar value to Toski in that those very early turns. And then you can flash it back later. So the flashback, I think, is what really pushes this card to an interesting place for me, because I don't mind playing this as a draw 2 very early, just as essentially like, read the bones or like a Sign in Blood type of effect. Like an early draw 2, potentially like even more if I then get to play a Mana Dork or something like that. Because if the game gets grindy, I can then flash it back for 4 mana. And obviously if the game gets to that point where you've got like a ton of Najeela tokens, this can easily draw you 10 cards. Like the ceiling on this card is absurd. So it's got a nice floor. It's got a reasonable floor. And it's got, an insane ceiling, obviously. And so I like the fact that this card is usable even early. It's also even usable if the Najeela plan has been disrupted, because you can kind of just like baby Storm off using, like Carpet of Flowers as like a draw trigger, and then like, you draw into a Birds of Paradise, and like, you're kind of drawing through those dead draws that are just mana dorks after like a board wipe or something has occurred. Whereas like a lot of the other options, if you look at like Toski, or if you look at like Edric, there are situations where these feel very win more, because like, you play them when you're already pretty ahead on board and you're like already like able to connect with people. And like you're just netting warriors. And so like everything's kind of going well for you anyway.
Right.
It's good in a lot of situations, even if things are not going perfectly well for you. So that makes it interesting. So I know that's maybe I'm like less enthusiastic about this card than I was about like Moonsilver Key, but that's because I don't know if it makes the cut, but I'm actively testing it, and I've been reasonably impressed thus far.
Yeah. Cobble, do you think this has a home anywhere outside of Najeela potentially?
This brings me back to a version of Derevi that I made a long time ago. That was a Token Storm deck that
the Wizard Ball
used. No, not Wizard Ball.
Oh.
It used more instants and sorceries than creatures.
Oh, I see.
It used Beck and Call, which is very similar to Rite of Harmony.
Flurry of Wings
but it
stuff. Yeah.
But it and Dovescape.
Yeah, nice.
But running things like Sylvan Offering and Sprout Swarm and Luminarch Ascension and Sacred Mesa, all of which, when you first of all create a ton of tokens, you get a ton of Derevi triggers. So all of those tokens can, trigger, and all of them pile up on Gaia's Cradle, which is creating a whole lot of mana because there's so many creatures, and you're untapping it and retapping it, generating all more
the
creatures.
Win condition in every version of Derevi. That's what people don't realize about that card. It doesn't matter what version of Derevi you're playing. Gaia's Cradle is the win condition.
So this one, this makes me want to go and revisit that list and see if it can be, if there's enough tools to actually make it more than just a meme. That would be the dream, but that's where I'm going to try it.
Okay.
Yeah. I should note that I cut a land for this card, which like feels pretty reasonable. Like, because, I wouldn't want to cut a land for a 4-drop. Man. But like cutting a land for a 2-drop that can like just kind of cycle pretty readily.
That's such a Phoenix move. That's such a Jeremy move.
I mean, but at the same time, like how much mana like Najeela doesn't need that much mana. Like Derevi costs 3 mana to win.
Count to
with,
5.
Right? Like Najeela makes her own resources. So it's I'm testing it, right? And it hasn't really punished me yet. So
Phoenix has been really high on it. He's liked it a lot.
Yeah. I think again, like sometimes you get those situations where like Phoenix was even telling me like where he did exactly what I described with Dockside, where he took like an extra combat with it. And then like kind of drew a ton of cards just by taking an extra combat step off of like a particularly fat Dockside. So that's sweet. Like that has yet to happen to me, but I really hope that it will. The other cool thing about this card that kind of, for anyone who might be wondering like why we never play like a Beck and Call type of card, is that it's an instant. And that's actually like quite relevant for Najeela because you open yourself, like it's weird that it's an instant because like it's only creatures that enter the battlefield under your control. So like how often do you actually like plan on casting this on somebody else's turn? Not super often, but like in Najeela, it's relevant because you cast it when you have the Najeela triggers on the stack. So like you can't just get blown out by like having to cast this in the main phase and then somebody removes Najeela and then you get no value out of it. It's very safe from that perspective. If it gets countered, it gets countered, but like at least you didn't get like 2-for-1s, right?
Right. Next card on this list is a card that I'm actually kind of excited about. I think this is an interesting shell is Katilda Dawnhart Prime. It's a green-white human warlock that is a 1/1, and it's a legendary creature that has protection from werewolves. And human creatures you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color in this creature's, or add 1 mana of any of this creature's colors there. I can read, guys, I swear. And then it also has the ability of being like a Gavany Township. You tap for 4 colorless, a green and a white. You tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So when we look at this card, Cobble, and the type of shells that this is going into, where does this kind of land as a card and as a deck?
I think, probably fits in stacks decks that are already running a lot of hate bears. That so one of the things about the old Terevi hate bear lists was that you would have these static abilities on these hate bears, and then generally you wouldn't get any other value out of them, but being able to attack and then untap or tap down other permanents allowed them to kind of do double duty, where they would have their static effect plus the ability to generate mana or to deny mana to other players. This is similar in that that as long as the hate creatures that you're using or the value creatures that you're using, like Esper Sentinel, happen to be humans, then they're also mana dorks as well. So this can, if this is your commander, it can allow you to not run mana dorks, but run more low cost or efficient humans that have some sort of upside that then allows you to kind of use them flexibly, either for mana or for doing other things. But seeing this in the 99, it may. I mean, we've had Cryptolith Rite and other effects similar to this, and they don't really see play. I don't know if this in the 99 is compelling enough to warrant a slot in the green white plus green white X stacks lists. It just depends on about the density of humans that you're going to have there to dictate how much value you're going to get out of it.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely a commander, in my opinion. I don't think that I would play this over Cryptolith Rite, and I don't know that I would play Cryptolith Rite. But I do think as a commander, it's pretty compelling because, like you said, you don't have to play dorks. You can pretty much focus up on playing high value creatures. Pongo, what are your thoughts on Katilda?
I mean, so I get what you're saying, where you're putting forth the notion that you might not have to play dorks because this is a 2-drop, but I feel like ultimately you probably still do want to play dorks.
I think you still
because,
do.
You want the mana acceleration. So I don't know that you're actually even getting that kind of value of improving sort of your deck card quality by not playing mana dorks, if that's how we want to frame it. Additionally, I don't even know that there would be enough particularly good humans in this color combination to fill those slots that you would want to play over mana dorks anyway. I know you're pretty high on this card, Callahan, but I personally kind of just don't see it. It's possible that we have to talk through this card and through the lines, after the show or some other time. Maybe I'm missing something, but from my perspective, the issue with a deck like this is that you generally want to be drawing cards if you're going to be playing such a slow game plan that's going to rely on you getting enough humans into play such that you can effectively win with this as a combo enabler. I can see like the obvious lines with like Emil and stuff like that, but like it still takes like a good amount of board presence to do that. I'm not so sure that I would play this over another similar option that can draw cards, or just an option in higher colors, right? Because I don't think it's a powerful enough engine or combo enabler to warrant giving up those options.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair, I suppose. I don't know. The thing that really brings me to it is the fact that it is sort of a win con in the command zone, because you can just, make a pretty big board. If you have, once you have a meal and like, I believe Village Bellringer, you just make infinite mana
with enough humans,
and then
right? Yeah.
Right. Well, you have to have 4 humans to make infinite mana with it, right?
Which is not trivial, because you also don't get to use the Bellringer as one of those, because it'll be summoning sick.
Right.
Right. But like, it doesn't really matter, right? Because once you get the chain going, you're off. And there are, I've noticed this through playing a lot of Academy Rector stuff, is I think we underestimate how many really good human creatures there are in the meta. And I think there's more than people realize, like, because it's I believe it's like the most common creature type besides elves. And I think like elves, humans, and goblins are the 3 most common creature types. And so you're not going to have a lack of options for it. It's certainly, I will say that, like, I'm not going to say it's like an S tier commander, right? But I think it's exciting. It plays very similarly from what I can tell through goldfishing it. I'd have to find the list that I was goldfishing earlier. But it plays very similar to Adaptive Sisay, but it's more explosive than Sisay can be, because you can play your commander and get your game going on turn 1 a lot more reliably than Sisay can. So I don't know. It's a pretty interesting commander. I don't know that it's going to be like amazing, but it's something that I'm intrigued to brew around and give a shot. And I'm always interested in like these kind of low color, kind of fringe decks anyhow, as evidenced by the deck that I champion. Right. So it checks all the boxes for me, right? It's a white X commander that's a human. It's low color. Like it's perfect for me. It's my green Lavinia.
I mean, like,
sorry, go
I was
ahead.
just gonna say I kind of wonder how it compares to Thrasios Livio, right? Where I kind of feel like they can be built with somewhat similar game plans, like at least in terms of how you're ultimately going to win. But then you get like the advantage of, both Thrasios and blue, right?
I think Livio is just an awkward card, though.
That could be, but it is
every deck I've tried to build with Livio is really strange, and work. It's very clunky, is kind of my experience with it. Not that this is not clunky, but I think that there's a lot of like it's a stacks deck, right? Like I think it's a pretty reasonable stacks deck, but onto a card that is actually probably going to see a decent amount of play, as probably like the new blue-red Storm deck, is Vadrik Astral Archmage. And it is a colorless blue and a red human wizard. That's a 1/2. And it says, if it's neither day nor night, it becomes day as Vadrik Astral Archmage enters the battlefield. It's interesting that it's not when, it's as. So it's a before that, I believe it triggers before it enters the battlefield. Other ability says instant sorcery spells you cast cost X less to cast, where X is Vadrik's power. And whenever day becomes night or night becomes day, put a +1/+1 counter on Vadrik. So Pongo, I know that Reed, we've talked about Sick Robot earlier in the episode and stuff that he's been doing. he's been brewing this commander, and it's a very similar type of deck to like Mizzix, right?
Yeah, absolutely. What's nice about this commander in comparison to Mizzix is that you can kind of like cheat to get it fatter in a lot of ways. You don't have to kind of do that whole like stepping stone, like accumulating experience counters thing. You can kind of just use like the red pump spells to make him swole, and then you start getting like the big discounts on all of your spells. So like you're essentially getting to turn, target creature gets +3/+0 into a ritual. In you can conceive of it that way, which is pretty cool. And it's certainly something that you don't get access to with Mizzix, who really wants you to be like, playing your 1 mana spell and then your 2 mana spell and then your 3 mana spell, to like gradually get those experience counters. So this feels like it has the potential to be a lot more explosive, and consistently able to execute that kind of plan, of let's just say netting massive discounts, because that's kind of what they're both doing. At which point you get to more reliably and more consistently cast those really, really big spells that are highly impactful, or those big X spells, that you get to pump a lot of, quote unquote mana into. But in this case, you're kind of just pumping free into,
right.
I'm not really sure how to conceptualize this resource. So, the other thing that I like about this commander is that it's 3 mana instead of Mizzix's 4. One thing that Mizzix has going for it, is that you get to keep those experience counters as Mizzix dies, but like, going from 4 to 6 to 8 is kind of rough, compared to going from like 3 to 5. Yeah.
And you have to start playing worse cards, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's also like not unreasonable for it to go from like night to day, with Vadrik, which is like, you wouldn't think about that so much as like an option, but it does make him bigger. So it kind of like nets you advantages. If somebody just passes the turn, holding up a spell, like choosing not to cast something, then all of a sudden it's night, and it's pretty trivial for you to make it day, because you're playing the type of deck that wants to cast 2 spells. So like if that happens to happen, like it just accidentally, you're also just automatically getting like 2 experience counters, more or less.
I mean, it just like starts the cycle when it comes into play. You know what I mean? So it starts the day-night cycle.
It makes it
as
day.
It comes into play. Right. So that means it can flip back and forth though from there.
Yeah, but you're not going to go straight to night because it counts as your spell.
Well, right. But that's kind of what I'm saying though, is like
it enables that.
You would think it enables getting into that where it will just kind of eventually get bigger, sort of as the game goes on.
Realistically, it's a cEDH, and like a lot of the, it's not incredibly common that people pass without casting any spells. But like, there are certain situations where it happens, and it's kind of just free value for an opponent doing nothing, which is like, I don't know, worth mentioning at least. Yeah. And in certain matchups, I would say is more likely to happen than others.
The thing is that I like about it is that its floor, what I think puts it over Mizzix, is its floor is Baral. Right. And so Mizzix comes down and then you have to start casting spells. This just comes down and it's Baral immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think it's just much easier to efficiently get like massive like power upgrades on this guy. Right. There's even a card with Storm that gives creatures you control +1/+0. So like, yeah, exactly. Like, which is kind of nutty with this guy. So
this deck is so cool.
Yeah, and like even like some of those like pump spells like have incidental other benefits, like drawing, like cantripping, or like you get to make a treasure or something like that. So they're not like even all that terrible, frankly, like if you pick the right ones. So I don't know. It definitely to me feels like an upgrade over Mizzix. You know, if only by virtue of the fact that it's like a mana cheaper, and then, you know, like you said, its floor is Baral, and then in addition, like you can enable it so much more easily.
Cobble, what are your thoughts on this card?
I think that Pongo is actually underselling how good of an effect the ritualization of pump spells is. Because when you think of a ritual, like you cast Dark Ritual and you get 3 mana.
I thought I was pretty high on them.
Yeah. In this case, it's a ritual that's a perpetual ritual that compounds with every other ritual that you're casting.
Unless it's unless it is, unless you pass the turn, right? Because a lot of those bonuses are only until end of turn.
Right, but in a single turn,
yeah.
You know, if you cast Haze of Rage multiple times, for instance, then every spell you cast after that are X spells are going to, you know, have that
and you can move phases.
Same amount of benefit.
Like you can move phases. You can go to attack. You don't lose the power toughness. So it's like the mana didn't drain from your pool effectively, I think is what you're
right.
Like the mana sticks around, I think is what you're getting out.
So I mean, certainly you compare them to rituals and they're better than your standard ritual. So I agree with that.
Particularly with X spells or with you know, things that go mana positive like Frantic Search or similar, where, you know, you or Reality, what's the one that just untap everything? It's an X spell.
Okay, I don't know.
if the deck is even playing that one.
Right. But I mean, it is it's faster than you would expect. It's faster than Mizzix.
Certainly.
By a great degree. And it is quite explosive. So, and you know, it's got access to the recursion that Red has through, you know, things like Past in Flames and Underworld Breach and Mizzix Mastery. So it can generate a storm count very, very quickly, and doesn't need a whole lot to get started. It just needs its commander on the board.
Yeah, I think that you know, to your point, you know, about the ritualization of the pump spells and so on and so forth. The other, I think, major advantage that Vadrik has over a card like Mizzix is that, you know, Mizzix is kind of asking you to cast a lot of spells to start getting your engine rolling with Mizzix. Whereas, and at that point, you're not getting the discounts with those cards, which is kind of a shame. Right. You know, you can kind of gas out relatively easily in doing that. Whereas here you've got, you know, like you were saying, Cobblepott, like all these kind of like single cards that subsequently make the rest of your cards already just enabled right out of the gate. You know, I think Mizzix ends up having to spend a good amount of resources before you really get to go nuts. Whereas this, you know, you don't have to make nearly as big of an investment.
Right, you pump them once, and then your Jessica's Will costs one.
Yeah, this is a really, really interesting card. The deck is also playing stuff like Flux Channeler. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, proliferate, which is hilarious.
Yes,
I love that. I am so psyched to have this on the channel because once we start doing gameplay again, I want to see Sick play this on the channel so bad. I think this is such a cool deck. It makes Fists of Flame good, like super good.
Is Sick running Burgee in that list?
He is.
I don't know that.
No, he's not. Yeah. No, he's not. He's playing Stormkiln Artist though.
Yeah. Okay. The only thing I'm not sure about with Flux Channeler is that like you do need to get the +1/+1 counter on Vadrik, right?
Mm-hmm.
Before that does anything. I'm not missing anything with that, and that like you're kind of expecting to get it from his ability.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that there's anything else that really takes advantage of proliferating otherwise. So if you do get it, then it's nutty.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing is it's whenever you cast a non-creature spell. So like at that point, like every spell you cast turns into a ritual, right?
Sort of.
Yes.
It yes and no, right? Because there's a big difference between discounts and like actually having mana. You know, the big difference is that a discount doesn't pay for like the 1 blue that like the discount can cover. I mean, whereas the discount covers like all the colorless components of the spell. So that's kind of like my only concern with a card like that here. But I can see how if you get the whole engine rolling, you get 1+1/+1 counter on him, you're kind of off to the races at that point.
Yeah. This is a really cool card. I'm super excited to see what happens with this. Now that we're done with the Midnight Hunt standard set, looking at the commander set, there were a couple cards that really popped out to us. Only 2 of them, really. And the first one is Empty the Laboratory, which costs X in a 2 blue. And it's a sorcery that says sacrifice X zombies, then reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a number of zombie creature cards equal to the number of zombies sacrificed this way. Put those cards onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So Cobble, is this finally the enabler we've been looking for Shadow Bag?
Maybe. It's, we'll have to see on that. But this is the people who have been talking about this are talking about it mainly in the context of 2 different commanders. One being Varina, that is the Esper commander that whenever it attacks, it generates zombies, or it doesn't generate zombies, but if it attacks with zombies, it draws cards, discards cards, and gains life. And then you can exile cards to create zombies. And the other one is the original Sultai Sidisi, that whenever you mill creature cards into your graveyard, you create zombies. Yeah. And the idea here is that you really only need 2, an X of 2 to be able to assemble a win con, with the primary win con being Vile Entomber plus Corpse Connoisseur, which both happen to entomb themselves when they come into play. So you cast Empty the Laboratory for 2, and you polymorph basically those 2 cards onto the battlefield, and then you get to entomb 2 more cards, and the 2 more cards that you entomb are Razaketh and Dread Return. And ostensibly, you've got enough zombies hanging around to be able to, cast the Dread Return, bring Razaketh in, and then assemble the win con of your choosing, most likely being Thassa's Oracle plus Consultation. But like you alluded to, Callahan, I will be giving it a shot in both of those shells to see if we can make a Shadow Bag list that actually
finally gets over the hump,
that actually works, because in that case, all you need is an X of 2 as well to put Putrid Imp and Bone Miser onto the battlefield.
One thing that might not be a bad idea is the commanders for those also is Tormod the Desecrator and Crom, because they're both zombies in your command zone that are not, like in Tormod too, whenever you 1 or more cards leave your graveyard, create a tapped 2/2 black zombie, and that looks like a shadow outlet to me.
That is possible.
Grixis.
Yeah.
Did we
see?
Solve
I'm over here
format?
cooking up the. We figured it out.
My favorite. I really like having green in the color identity for that. Because of crop rotation. Yeah. To be able to get the emergent zone in there, but there's lots of things to try.
It'll be interesting. Yeah. Pongo, any ideas with this deck? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. What I really like about this card is that it gives sort of 1 card win condition potential to a lot of decks or a couple of decks, I should say, that previously didn't necessarily have great options for that. Obviously, Sidisi, classic Hermit Druid commander. But, if you look at like
And Food Chain Commander, excuse
yes,
you.
I was getting to that. If you look at like the things that have historically been layered with, it is kind of like the original Bean Dip deck where it's like infinite layers. And like it's kind of, I guess, historically like the poster child for that. But like the problem is that, and like I think it's always kind of been an issue with that deck. Your card quality takes such a massive dump. And also like the commander itself doesn't dig you out of the hole of like you drawing into like extra combo pieces and, or like, you know, drawing the wrong half of this combo here and, you know, the wrong half of this combo there. You know, this is nice because a lot of your plan is just in the command zone with Sidisi. And it means that you only need like the one tutor to get this card and then assemble your whole combo. And, you know how I feel about one card win conditions. I think that, you know, any deck that can play them needs to take a serious look at them because there is very little that you can do in this format, in my opinion, that is stronger than that. Particularly when you also combine it with having access to black in your color identity. Because then you end up having a lot of redundancy for your one card win conditions. So I think it's really, you know, quite interesting. And, you know, I don't know that it's necessarily good enough to, let's say, revive, you know, decks like Sidisi, you know, that have kind of fallen by the wayside, or, you know, push Varina or however you pronounce it into sort of a more viable direction or in the realm of viability. But it's cool. It's a very cool design. And I think that, you know, I look forward to seeing the decks that it spawns.
Yeah. And hopefully a successful shadow bag deck.
Hopefully,
that's what I'm hoping for. I love shadow bag so much. I think it's such a cool like
apparatus
that you created. I love it. But the last card on our list here is Drown in Dreams, which is an instant that costs X, 2 colorless and a blue. And it says choose one. If you control a commander, as you cast the spell, you may choose both. And one of the abilities is target player draws X cards, the other one is target player mills twice X cards. So when we look at this one, Pongo, this definitely has some stroke of genius qualities to this. You know, what are you thinking with this card?
Yeah, I mean, so this seems like a really interesting card. You know, obviously, I think Vadrik could consider it, right? Just being another like X mana outlet. That also you can target yourself and mill yourself if you're doing like breach things.
It is in 6. Yeah. It is in 6 lists.
You do get to do both if you have your commander out, which is pretty sweet. But then, you know, where this is like kind of an obvious slam dunk conclusion is just in Kinnan, where it's just, as you mentioned before, kind of like it is a strictly better version of Stroke of Genius. And like, it's not often that I actually get to say that without somebody like being able to be like, well, what about this corner case where it's not strictly better? No, like this one is actually just strictly better. Like fairly unambiguously, which is pretty sweet. So, you know, what I like about this card is that it kind of ups the sort of win con density in that deck, post getting Basalt Monolith online. You know, it's never really been an issue before for the most part, but like, you know, you could sort of like contrive situations where it would be an issue, you know, suppose like you're unable to assemble like Scepter combo, and like you also don't have access to Finale, and like, you know, I recently cut Regrowth, so like, you know, when this card was spoiled, but like if you aren't playing Regrowth, then you might not have Time Twister Loops as a viable option, just with Noxious Revival. But like, you know, now that we have this card, you kind of get that like Blue Sun Zenith effect where, you know, without having to play Blue Sun Zenith, you can get infinite mana, draw your deck by like cheating Thrasios into play and have that whole thing going. And then this card can sort of simultaneously kill 2 players in one card by making one opponent draw their whole deck and then some and lose instantly. And you can then also mill another player out simultaneously. And then, you can just recur this card and kind of do the same thing, similar to like what you would do with the Blue Sun Zenith, but with a much more attractive casting cost, at least for the purposes of Kinnan. So it's cool. Like, it's not changing anything radically in that deck, but it is just a better stroke of genius, right? We win and lose games on those little margins and stuff like that. So we always have to keep an eye out for when a card gets power crept ever so slightly.
Marriott, Cobble, any thoughts on this card?
I don't think I have anything really to contribute beyond that. I mean,
it's stroke of genius.
I mean, it's way more than stroke of genius. Just it feels like so in the case of using it as a win con, you have your commander on the board and you take out 2 players, and then you use a regrowth effect to
like
take out the 3rd
revival player? You have that option, or like whatever else you're using as your like theoretical way to make an opponent draw, like your last opponent draw cards.
Okay.
Yeah. Well,
that's cool.
That is the last card on our list. So that about wraps things up for us here today. It's been a pleasure getting back and doing this with you guys. So a couple of housekeeping things to keep in mind for as a show that we're going to be doing here on this channel that will be coming up here soon is a D&D game called Paths in Prophecy that we're doing here on the Mind Sculptors. We're doing that with the Venture Maidens, which is a group that Sage is a part of. And that is going to be a campaign set in Theros that is going to be led by Sage. They're going to be our game master for this game. And the players in the game are going to be Lenny, also known as a Johnny's Gay Pride Mate, Clayby from CNC Power Hour, Charles, and myself. And so the first episode you can catch will be October 4th. I believe it will be, I want to say 9 p.m. Eastern time. I'll double check on the time and put it in the comments. But you can check that out on the Venture Maidens Twitch channel and then afterwards on our YouTube channel. So with that, just a quick reminder that you can follow us for any updates on Twitter at SculptyBoys, BOIS, or you can find a direct link to our Twitter in the link tree in the description below. You can also find links to all of our Mox Fields and all of our Twitters if you want to find our opinions on things or look at the decks we're brewing and stuff like that. Want to also give an extra shout out to all of our patrons who help keep the lights on. If you too would like to become a patron, you can head on over to patreon.com/the Mind Sculptors or check out the link in the description. Thank you all again for joining us today, and from all of us here at the Mind Sculptors, I'm Callahan, and we'll see you next time.
I'm in line with the stars, I'm in sync with the earth. 10 toes deep, flower child from the turf. I never switch sides, like even when I die, I'm a ride for the squad, let up ties in the hearse. I've been on the vibe, kinda hard to describe. I'm in between, I'm good and it's fine, but I'm tired of the grind. Then I come alive in the night to realize I'm in the middle of the time of my life. I'm never so packed for the stack, never lied on the rap. Got a bag from the way that I write it. Queen looking Tyson, do that ass survive, doing 80 to the house. Then I hit it to the sky, change haters on a tirade. Talking to they crib in the face, be still, let that hate stuff fade. We all want the same, we all want a meal in the safe. I wanna live like I'm trying to reach enlightenment. Trail spill from my lips, feel bent from the bib. Take a sip till I pass out. Try and get grit, but it don't make sense. Cause you can lose life on this fast route. Yeah, turn thoughts to a cash cow. I might flip that to the glass house. I don't need the accolades, I'm in love with the chase. I just wanna eat, save a spot at the table. Beats with the slap, pin myself on the map. You long with the wind, but we knowing that it's cap. 5-hour flights, couple nights at the flat. To be real, couldn't see me making moves while I'm at. I'm still on the grind, limit time when I chat. I'm burning down sage, keep the demons away. When I write it, give a piece of myself to the page. I don't do it for the praise, love, that's just how I'm made.
Truth in the glass in the mirror.
Yeah.
Do it at me, old man, tryna pass in the fear. You're the first one to talk, but the last one to hear. Eyes blurry, but I couldn't see the ass any clearer.